Thank you for your presentation. It was very inspiring. So in your lecture, you have just drawn an analogous relationship between 1914 and 2014. So my question is, despite the fact that the Second World War in 1939 was actually based on extreme nationalist countries such as Germany, which has a totalitarian dictatorship, and this actually doesn't exist now in the world. Like, it's not that extreme as Germany. So despite the fact that there isn't any existing totalitarian governments in the world right now, would you foresee that it would be reasonable, would you foresee that there might be like a similar situation in 2039, a similar situation in 2039 as the one in 1939? Thank you.
Historians know nothing about the future and are reluctant to talk about it. I'm reminded of Niels Bohr's, the famous physicist, comment that prediction is very difficult, especially when it's about the future. And so I don't know. But that's a really thoughtful question. What brought on 1939 was the Versailles Conference, the Paris Peace Treaty, which created an untenable situation for Germany and created a whole series of small countries that Germany felt ought to be within their orb. Germany still wanted Lebensraum. They wanted living space. And Hitler could look at this punitive peace that came in 1919, and he could say, we need to change that. That brought 1939. Is there anything that looks remotely like that in today's world? Recall the Europe map and the Balkans. What has Putin done lately? He has grabbed control, full control of the Crimea. He has designs on at least the eastern segment of Ukraine. He's trying to roll back, and in very vociferous ways, trying to roll back what Europe has done in trying to create the European Union. Is Russia powerful? No. Should we be afraid of Russia? Probably not. I don't think it is a great power anymore, but there is that ethnic difference. There is the Pan-Slavism. It's still there. And one could imagine that 20 years from now, there might be something to this. We were so impressed with, when we were in the Balkans lately, at the continuation of all the struggles that the Balkans have had, for well over 1,000 years. That's still a hot spot, and it's still disunited and difficult to rule. I don't know the answer to your question. It was a dandy question, though, and we could talk all day about it, but it would be kind of idle speculation, I'm afraid. But it's a great question.
Okay, thank you for very interesting comparison of the 1914 and 2014. And I would like to speak of some of the differences. You draw a lot of similarities and also a lot of materials, charts. I think particularly think of Germany and China, because you mentioned that it's a rising power in different times. I would think that two differences that is important. One is Germany as a country, as a smaller country, I mean in Europe, and Europe historically has so many different countries and conflicts. China historically is a big country, is a big empire, so therefore the tension to expand is less in China. Anyway, in history that is the case. Another difference is that the population. China has a huge population, therefore per capita, even though the charts are very impressive, Chinese economy and its growth and so on, but considering the big population and the internal problems in China, I think that's a very different situation compared with Germany in 1914. So in other words, I think the situation is more different than similar. Yeah.
You're probably right, but it was my talk. No, I agree with you, frankly. China has been a continental power. Only during the early Ming did we have these vast seaborne explorations, and they were vast. But then the Chinese stopped them for, I think, political reasons internally. So other than that, until this moment in time, China's not had a blue water navy. And now the one big difference is that China is looking at a blue water navy and looking to project power, not just in the East and South China Seas, but well into the Indian Ocean. And is already, as I mentioned earlier, in the Indian Ocean. So I agree with you there. And of course, the disparity in population. And while China's total productivity might well surpass the United States, per capita productivity, it's a long ways away, if ever. And of course, that creates pressures, and I didn't get a chance to talk about that, but pressures within China. If you've added 300 million people to the middle class, they have rising expectations now that would parallel what you have in Hong Kong. For the good life, for reasons to be happy, to be fruitful in what they do. That's the pressures that will force something, could force something bad to occur inside China. It's population pressures. Oh, we could talk about China's problems till we're blue in the face. The aging of the population, where there won't be enough workers to support the weight of people like my age in China, who don't have their own resources. Healthcare, big issue. We didn't even talk about the global issues that are confronting all of us. And that's another powerful reason for cooperation between China and the United States. So you're right on. I don't disagree for a moment.
Linda.
Yeah, what is puzzling me is what brings nations or communities which happens to be competing with one another into major conflicts like the war that happened in 1940 and also 1939. Because I think, having a bit of tension and conflict is no big deal, right? Because we're all different, I think this is healthy indeed. And also, towards the end of your talk, you mentioned universities. We're always competing, right? But we don't go into wars. We are more collaborating, and competition is actually objective. Have an idea. So what do you think? Why? When we talk about China is emerging as a bigger power, and then U.S. In relative decline, it's only relative. Okay, it's still
Yes,
great
yes.
power. Then why all this so much talk about the possibility of having a major Third World War, right? So is it because sometimes how depends on your perception who that person is? If I perceive this is actually a friend, then I won't see that I might go into a war because he's doing good, right? So
Yes.
so what really accounts for that perception of the other party, that why he or she is a potential enemy rather than potential friend?
Exactly.
Insights.
I have two responses to that. One, it's always been my perception that Americans and Chinese have more in common than they have in difference. The way we behave as a people, as two peoples, is so similar. Both peoples have an incredible work ethic, just incredible. I've never known people to work as hard as Chinese do. Americans maybe don't work quite that hard anymore, but there is that commonality. I came to know a Chinese captain of a ship very, very well over a period of years, and he said to me, once we're friends, Chinese never cease to be your friend. And he had a negative comment about some other countries. But there was this commonality of effort and of belief that we could work together. So what would cause that to be blown apart? It could be the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in 1914 July. That was a single event. Now, he was heir to the throne, but that tipped the conversation. The Russians began to get involved, the Austro-Hungarians got involved, and pretty soon that thing just blew up. It was a small event. What worries people about the South China Sea, well, East China Sea. China has now pronounced a no-fly zone, in essence, over the Diaoyu Islands. Well, those are Japanese-held islands, and have been for years. That could result in shooting war. Japan could be drawn in. What would the United States do at that point? We have the Mutual Defense Treaty with Japan. We have troops in Japan. We have troops in South Korea. What would the United States do? We have my nephew, who's an admiral in the Navy, who is in Tokyo and is in charge of all American submarines in Asia, the Pacific, and the Central Command. What would he do if this thing blew up? Or what about the Philippines and the shoal there? Would that ever lead to, these are insignificant places, but it could draw in the great powers if good leadership was not there to stop it. I have some faith, I hope it's well placed, that Xi Jinping would not allow that to happen. What I don't know about the United States is who's going to succeed Obama. Obama wouldn't let it happen. But in a democracy, crazy things happen. So I think it's the small flashpoints. It's where one political scientist talked about where the civilizations rub together and you have frictions there. And that could happen in the South China Sea. I hope it never will. But that's an excellent point of view and a good question.
Susie?
Thank you for a very thought-provoking lecture, and I'm glad you mentioned Semester at Sea because they contacted us, so I'll talk to you about that afterwards. But, okay, my point, conflict and the insignificant place. Let's take Hong Kong and Occupy, right? And the untenable positions that haven't yet arisen out of this between US and China, but could. On the face of things, right now, the US does not wish to get terribly involved. Obama is not saying very much. There's just been an incident, just reported in the New York Times, about, and it's harping on that same question of outside forces interfering, which of course has always been a suggestion it's a US
Yes.
interference. There is a graduate student from City University, actually, who has been named as a possible spy, or has been placed that way. He denies it, of course, and he says he has nothing to do with it. But he's been seen going around taking photographs. He's actually just doing a research report, as far as I can tell. But that untenable position of the outside interference, and if it actually gets named as US, wouldn't that be the kind of issue, the kind of conflict issue that could spark something even out of an insignificant place like Hong Kong?
I shouldn't get involved in internal politics. But when we look at Hong Kong, and we've been privileged to be in and out of Hong Kong many times, and I think I'm kind of a typical American. We think Hong Kong, when you go back to the turn of the handover, 1987, I was actually here when that happened, and I recall the situation was set up by the British and the PRC to gradually move toward bona fide democracy, elected democracy. So my point of view as a private American citizen is, jeepers, I wish this could be resolved. I wish that, I think the United States has no business trying to resolve it. I think it is I was going to say an internal Chinese affair, maybe it is. But then there's my fundamental feeling about Hong Kong, that it is a beacon here in a lot of ways. And I value this openness that we could have in this meeting. You would have more difficulty on the mainland doing this. So yes, would Hong Kong's fate be important enough to the United States that we might get involved? We've been involved in a lot of goofy places, which are much less important than Hong Kong.
Let's take two more questions. Professor Salenson, and then you had a question over there. Over here? Oh, okay.
Thank you. Thank you for your... Thank you for your very inspiring talk. I just wanted to come back to your point about nationalism and to recall that the war in 1914 was also a consequence of the war in 1870,
Yes, it
when
was.
France was defeated.
Yes.
And in fact, France dramatically wanted the war. For instance, Jean Jaurès was murdered on the 21st of July 1914,
Yes.
just for the war to happen, you see.
Yes.
So I think, by the way, it's to be optimistic. I believe that one way to fight against all that might happen, it is through education, educating people. If people are educated, they won't be nationalistic. That is what, at least I believe. When you think that the president of a country, before being elected, had never visited China, and when he visited China, he stayed 32 hours.
Well, I agree. Your point of view is a good European historian's point of view. And I know you are a good European historian. So there's no question but what the frictions could be overcome, I think. And your point about Jaurès is exactly right. There were forces within these countries, France particularly, who were anti-war and knew the cataclysm that could descend on France. France had lost the Franco-Prussian War, 1870-71. That led to the unification of Germany, and from that point, Germany became very muscular and saw itself as a real challenge, not just to Britain, but to France. And of course, that enmity between the French and the Germans, has it been really overcome? Don't know. But I hope it has. But you're right, that there's a consequence there of that Franco-Prussian War resulting in 1914.
You had a question, and then very last question over here.
First of all, thank you very much for giving such amazing talks. You compare China with Germany in 1914, but it's quite amazing. And I think that most of the Western magazines, articles, or journals compare China with Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So actually, I think that they have many similarities, like the Cultural Revolution, like the unfriendly relationship with American, like the highly centralized power in the party. So I would like to ask them some more sensitive question. Then will China have a leader like Mr. Gorbachev in the future? Will China have the same have a similar revolution? Will China have a similar reform like Mr. Gorbachev did in the 1980s? Will CCP's rule continue or come to an end like what happened in the Christmas of 1991? Thank you very much.
A wonderful point of view, wonderful questions. Will China, in essence, go the way of the Soviet Union in terms of glasnost and all of that? Here's my quick answer. China has proceeded along a much more orderly path than the Soviet Union did. The Soviet Union wanted to jump into democracy, into a new political system before they'd taken care of the economy. And that's the weakness of Russia now. It has a wretched economy, and the people are suffering, and so the Soviet Union, Russia these days, is not a threat. Now, China could, and of course you have to look at the next generation of leadership. South China Morning Post has a wonderful book out, by the way, which characterizes up and down the hierarchy all of the leadership in China right now. It's a wonderful, it's a difficult book. There's so many people. But what they are thinking about, the South China Morning Post and all the scholars who wrote in this, what's the next generation of leadership beyond Xi Jinping and Li? What's that going to be like? And will they be more interested in political change? We don't know that. I mean, this is 8 years away now. But the possibility is there because they're very different. They're educated differently. They're not technicians so much as they are more humanistically educated. One could imagine an evolution of China over time to more, I won't say democratic, but sort of a more representative kind of government. And I don't think they will likely go the way of the Soviet Union, which has been just chaotic. China has been much wiser than the Soviet Union.
Last question. This gentleman over here.
Thank you. I have a number of observations, but you can take them as a question. And some are related to previous points. For instance, since few centuries, like the state is a rationally organized monopoly of violence. So I'm surprised that we are still surprised that they only move through violence in what they do. And indeed, the war has been part of history at every stage of history, no matter if it was a republic, an empire, a democracy, a totalitarian state. And I see today we try to rationalize the war as a sort of solution, and we moralize the war, but this moralization, also for human rights, is causing new tensions, paradoxically. So isn't it a paradox that the means that we are employing to defeat the war are producing new wars, and isn't paradoxically, again, this part of the history and the dynamic of history? And I had few curiosity, because you seem to be quite an expert on China for these things, but going back to a German author that was Carl Schmitt, he theorized this friend and enemy theory. And it seems to me that China having tension on all of the borders, usually when countries have problems on the borders is because they want to distract people from the capital. So they want people to look outside rather than inside. And the very last point is about the role of the university. I have the feeling that the universities in the last decades have been moving towards like the business, which means less public role, and all of the people are just obsessed by entering an economy which contradictions are provoking conflicts that we are supposed to solve. And there is very little criticism and self-criticism inside the academia. And in 1914, the elite of the time was highly international, probably more international than many of the elite today. So I don't see how exchange programs by nature would necessarily change the situation.
Thank you.
Oh, we could be here for 2 hours. Those points are well taken. And I think it is the case that war, is it inevitable? Can't we find a way of dealing with our conflicts short of war? There's no evidence that we can, and that would be a negative point of view. Certainly universities have become much more, I'll just do these 2 points, have become much more bureaucratic. Certainly we have been reoriented toward, I will call it vocational work, so that students going out can enter immediately into the workforce with good paying jobs. We know that isn't happening, however. I think, clearly in China there's a disgruntlement on the part of many, many college graduates who cannot find work that's commensurate with their training. Same thing in the United States. So we have some tensions and pressures in higher education which are not positive. And we both know this. And administrators do pay attention to this. But it is a problem that's bigger than the universities. So the question is, can we operate our universities in a way that is novel and pays close attention to the needs of the culture and close attention to the needs of the students? In other words, more student-oriented. Don't know. These are big questions, and all these questions are for the young people here to resolve, since the old generation has not yet found the answers. Well, thank you very much. These are great questions.
Thank you.